Jean, did you want to get started?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know when to do that. So I wanted to welcome everybody in the garden group to Barbara Melera's Zoom. Barbara is president and CEO of the D. Landreth Seed Company, which is the oldest seed house in America. It was established in 1784. In September of 2003, she purchased Landreth from the then owners and proceeded to restore the company. Today, Landreth is recognized as one of the leading providers of heirloom vegetable, flower, and herb seeds. The company ships its products worldwide. I have been getting her blogs for many years, and I find that she's always on topic with whatever's happening in the season and has great suggestions and how to care for things. So I highly recommend her site, which I think I emailed everybody. So with that, I will say welcome, Barbara.
And
thank you.
I just also wanted to say my name is Jennifer Wordkin. I'm the director of the Wellfleet Library, and I had a little bit of a run through with Barbara last week. And the format that she has chosen is that she will be showing a few slides and then pausing for questions. And she has asked that anybody who has questions, please put them in the chat and I will relay the questions to her. So that's the format that we are going to be working with today. So so get ready to do that as you have questions as this presentation goes on.
All set?
Mm-hmm.
All right. I have to make one correction. I must have sent Jean the wrong bio. Landreth is kind of in a pause mode. I am no longer the president and CEO or owner of Landreth. A few years ago, I was asked to start a company for another old seed house, American seed house, and that is the Harvesting History logo that you see at the top of the screen. Harvesting History does many of the same things that our time at Landreth did, and is managed by former Landreth people. So we're very proud to keep on the tradition of a company that all of us very much loved. I have to warn you that today's presentation is not at all objective. I love dahlias and have for many, many, many years. The dahlias you see today have all been grown in our Harvesting History gardens over the last 5 to 10 years. So with that as an introduction, ladies and Dan, let's get started. This is just a preview. This little dahlia, not so little dahlia, is called Red Empire. And let's begin with some history. As many of you may know, dahlias are native to the highlands of Mexico, where they grow on mountainsides where the mountains reach about 12,000 plus feet. They experience what's called a moderate temperate climate. In the wintertime, the temperatures in the evenings will get into the low 50s, but rarely lower than that. The first Mexican dahlias were brought to Spain in the 1780s and became very popular very quickly. Then they made their way to Britain in 1798 and then France in 1802. They were named Dahlia after the 18th century Swedish botanist, and he was also a pupil of Linnaeus, Dr. Andreas Dahl. The scientists that have now studied dahlias believe that even though today there's probably about a dozen different dahlias that you can find in the wild, most of the dahlias, if not all of the dahlias that we know today, came from some very specific species. In fact, one species that had been cultivated by the Aztec for millennia. And almost everything we have today came from one specific species. Believe it or not, the dahlia was originally domesticated because the Aztecs in particular thought that it would be a food source. And unfortunately, the tubers, which is what they were looking at, proved to be inedible. But the petals were used in salads and also to color food. So the very first dahlias they thought were going to be food, and the poor dahlias failed miserably at this task. One of the things that I love about dahlias, and I love just about everything, is a historical book that was written in 1830 but wasn't published in 1851. And all of you know the author because I'll bet you get the catalog called Brecht's Bulbs. Brecht, the company, was founded by Joseph Brecht, and in the early 1800s, he was one of the great horticulturalists in America. He wrote this book, The Flower Garden, or eventually it was called Brecht's Book of Flowers. And in it, he had some endearing passages when it came to dahlias. Bear with me because I have to read you these. I sometimes read these just to get a laugh out of this when I think about dahlias. He wrote, and he was talking this time about hollyhocks. He wrote, "Hollyhock Indian spring, if I were not afraid of advancing a horticultural heresy, I should say that many amateurs prefer hollyhocks to dahlias." You're getting the gist of how he felt about dahlias. He then said, "The dahlia is a native of Mexico, found on the tablelands of that country, and I have sometimes wished it had been left alone there to waste its sweets on the desert air. It is so capricious in its flowering, so subject to the ravages of insects, so much influenced by too much heat or too much dryness or too much wet. And then, just as it begins to give promise of abundant bloom, having escaped all the casualties of the season, is cut down by the frost and becomes a blackened, hideous object in the garden." Now, can any of you imagine a horticulture writer talking about something so intimately today? Well, that was Joseph Brecht, and his book is filled with little anecdotal comments about the things that he loved and knew intimately. And he did know dahlias intimately. Let's get through in this talk the most important regimens that you need to understand if you're going to be successful dahlia growers. First of all, dahlia roots are sold as a cluster of tubers. In the last 2 years with the pandemic, a lot of so-called horticultural or bulb or seed retailers have come into existence. And I've had several of our customers ask us why people are selling single tubers. If you deal with a seed house or a bulb house that sells you a single tuber as a dahlia plant, don't deal with them again. Dahlias are meant to be sold as a cluster of tubers. It is true that from a single tuber, a plant will grow, but it usually takes 2 years before you get a blossoming plant. And it is very unprofessional to be selling people, especially new to the industry or new to dahlias, a single tuber. Healthy roots are fat and they don't have any wrinkling, but understand, and this will be important if you decide to keep your dahlias through the winter, wrinkly doesn't mean that the roots are dead. It does mean that the roots are dehydrated, and in all, not in all, but in many cases, they will rehydrate once they're put into the ground. However, it is a shock, and it does take those plants that have dehydrated significantly a while to get started. So when you're choosing dahlias, choose heavy roots, choose heavy tubers. And you can feel when you go through a box, you can feel that some are lighter, some packages are lighter and some are heavier. So choose the heavy roots. Now, the last thing is let's address the eye myth. I don't know who wrote this or where the information came from, but in a lot of cases with our customers, they say, I don't want that, it doesn't have any eyes. What they mean by eyes is that near the stem, the dahlia tubers are beginning to sprout. They're not true eyes like you see in things like evening primrose. They are tiny, tiny sprouts. The fact that a cluster of tubers doesn't have any sprouts yet doesn't mean that it's bad or poor or in any way inflicted with problems. The eye myth is exactly that. It's a myth. You buy dahlias early in the spring, and many of them do not have quote unquote sprouts or eyes. So don't pay any attention when somebody says if it doesn't have an eye, don't buy it. Okay, again, dahlias prefer organically rich loam because a lot of their energy goes into producing these huge plants with very thick stems. What you want to do when you are, after you've purchased your clusters of tubers, you want to gently go through each cluster and find last year's stem. There will always be a last year's stem. Some are very close to the tubers and are hard to find, but carefully go through a cluster of tubers and find last year's stem. That's the key. Then what you do is very gently arrange the tubers around that stem. You're going to dig a hole that's approximately 12, sometimes 18 inches deep. And then you're going to rest that cluster of tubers with the stem up in the middle of that hole and cover with at least 4 inches of soil. People tend to plant dahlias in too shallow a hole. You don't want to do that. And dahlias aren't sensitive to the depth at which they are planted. However, if you want to mitigate some of the problem with dahlias falling over, the deeper you plant that cluster of tubers, the less likely it will be that the dahlia falls over. So 4 inches is the bare minimum, 6, even 8 inches is fine. And in terms of separation, dahlias should be at least 12 inches apart and in rows 18 inches apart. One good thing about dahlias is it's really not necessary to fertilize dahlia tubers when you're planting them in the ground. But if you want, if you add at the time that you plant a timed release blossom booster fertilizer, that will produce more blossoms. Dahlias also require lots of water. And in the heat of the summer, even where you are in Wellfleet, it would not be unusual for you to have to water your dahlias once a day. Dahlias as plants will bloom from around mid-July. If you put them in around June, if you put them in mid-May, then probably the end of June, about 6 weeks after you put them in the ground, they'll start to bloom. But what is magnificent about dahlias, and please never forget this about these wonderful plants, dahlias come into their own in the fall. They are the last man standing in your garden, especially your gardens in Wellfleet, when it comes to November, even as late as Thanksgiving, and oftentimes into December. They will only truly perish with a hard frost. They just keep going and going and going. They are the energizer bunnies of the flower world. And that's, you'll see at the end of this talk, that's a very, very significant horticultural attribute. The other thing about dahlias is you have to deadhead them, and you should deadhead them vigorously. Dahlia blossoms, if you catch them early, will last in a vase up to a week. If you catch them after they've been fully opened, 2 or 3 days, they're only going to last about another 2 or 3 days. So please vigorously deadhead your dahlias. To give you an idea of how much time we spend with dahlias, this is a small part of our container garden for dahlias. This year we have 60 dahlias in containers, and every year we add more to that collection. Our constricting factor is where do we put the pots at the end of the year? So let's talk a little bit about planting dahlias in containers. Dahlias, at times I'm convinced that dahlias like it better in a container than they do in the ground itself. I don't know why that's the case, but our dahlias that we have in containers flourish. The size of the container needs to be a 14-inch diameter container with 12 to 14-inch depth. You're going to use a soil mix that consists of 6 parts topsoil, 2 parts peat moss, and 2 parts dehydrated cow manure, or if you are lucky enough to have it, compost. Then you're going to plant the tubers, and in this case, depth is significant. You want to plant those tubers at least 6 inches deep, because remember, things in containers are much more subjected to wind and wind damage than things planted in the ground. So you want to make sure that you plant these tubers deep enough so that their root system anchors them in that container. The other thing I should caution you about here is you want to make sure you never, never, never use specialized potting soil mixes. They are way, way, way too light. You need heavy topsoil, the cheapest product that they sell at Home Depot or Lowe's. That topsoil has the weight to it that will help those dahlias not sustain wind damage. And for sure, in the heat of the summer, dahlias planted in containers are going to require daily watering. Now, this is this year's dahlia garden at harvesting history. And like I said, we've got about 60 dahlias in containers this year, and we're just getting into the fall, so they're just beginning to explode with blossoms. In another 2 weeks, that entire garden is just going to be blossoms. You'll hardly notice the plants for the blossoms. But if you look at that one red dahlia in the center of this photo, that plant is 5.5 feet tall. It happens to be Manhattan Island dahlia, but it's absolutely gigantic this year, and so are its blossoms. Okay, let's talk a little bit about whether you at Wellfleet need to lift or not to lift dahlias. Depending on where you live in Wellfleet, if you're in zone 7, and I don't think Wellfleet gets any warmer than zone 7, you don't need to lift your dahlias. If, however, you're in hardiness zones 5 to 6, if you mulch those dahlias with 4 to 6 inches of mulch in the fall, not the mulch you put on in the spring, but a fresh coating of mulch in the fall, then they should survive the winter, unless you get a Lollapalooza like you had a couple of years ago, where I think you had, what was it, 14 feet of snow that one year, and you couldn't even make your way around downtown Boston. So in zones 5 to 6, mulch. In zone 7, shouldn't have to do anything. If for some reason you're in a unique area of Wellfleet, which is a hardiness zone 4, then you're going to have to lift your dahlias because they will not make it through a zone 4 winter. You should lift only after a hard frost has, in Breck's words, turned the dahlia into a hideous blackened object. So let nature do the work for you and kill off the top growth, and then you lift the tubers after that. Seems like I had one other point I wanted to make to you here. Well, it'll come to me. Okay. In terms of lifting, if you are intent upon lifting your dahlias, please try to choose a time when there hasn't been rain for a couple of days. And then make sure that you, out from the stem of the plant, you start to put your shovel in the ground no closer to that stem than 12 inches. And sometimes you'll find 12 inches isn't enough and you're going to cut through a tuber. You're also going to dig down at least 12 inches. You will not believe how big these tubers get once they're in the ground. So remember that you need to go way out from the stem in order to start your digging so that you don't cut through a tuber. Then what you do is, after you've removed the tubers from the soil, let them dry outside, out of direct sunlight. They don't need to be dark, just out of direct sunlight for at least 24 hours. And where you live, since it tends to be humid, I would easily let them dry for 2 or 3 days. Then after they've dried, just gently wipe the soil that you can from the tubers. They don't have to be brand spanking clean. They just need to have the excess soil removed gently from the tubers. And you're going to store them in a dry, dark area that has good air circulation. The thing that kills tubers, dahlia tubers, is mold or fungi. So you need to have good air circulation, and the area really has to be dry. Now, one thing that's often recommended is that you bury them in wood shavings or sawdust or peat moss or ripped up paper, whatever. I never do that. I throw my dahlia tubers into actually a wine crate and just leave them there. And I lose on an annual basis, and I store between 40 and 50 dahlias a year like this. I lose about 10% each year. But the rest, in the spring, they're shriveled, but they rehydrate quickly and they start to put up sprouts very soon after I put them into the ground. Now, let's talk a little bit about bringing dahlias that are in containers, what you do with them when you store them. Where you live, I would suggest bringing the containers inside, because you can get a series of very cold nights. And when that happens, the entire container could freeze. If that happens, dahlia tubers cannot withstand being frozen solid. So you need to keep that in mind. What you do is you completely cut back all of the top growth and clean the surface of the soil. And then you drag the pots into a carport or someplace like that. The one thing you want to make sure when you're storing container grown dahlias is, number one, don't take them out of the containers. But two, what I just said, you cannot have these containers freeze solid, because that will definitely kill your dahlia tubers. Also, do not water those pots throughout the winter. No water until you bring them outside in the spring. Okay, any questions?
The one question that somebody put was, is it okay to put the container on a porch? And I think you kind of addressed that, but
absolutely, it's a great place as long as the porch gets enough light. And you need the equivalent of solid sun from 10 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon in order for dahlias, whether they're in a pot or in the ground, to bloom for you. So it's great to keep them on a porch. Sun would be the issue. Anything else?
nope, not so far.
Okay, are you guys asleep? Wake up, we're in the next part. All right. There are many, many different classifications of dahlias. The one classification that is most respected at this point was put together by Britain's Royal Horticultural Society and the International Society of Dahlia Growers. And those two have named the bulleted dahlia classifications that you see on this slide. I'm going to go through each one of these classifications for all of you and also show you some magnificent examples of each. So let's talk about dinner plate dahlias. Two things. First of all, almost all of you know about dinner plate dahlias, and almost all of you say, oh, but I don't like them because their blossoms get so big and the plants fall over. Well, even little plants can fall over. So don't blame that entirely on dinner plate dahlias. But the interesting thing about dinner plate dahlias is, with one, maybe two exceptions, dinner plate dahlias, after they give you that first gigantic blossom, then come to their senses and give you much smaller blossoms, usually in the 6, maybe 7-inch diameter range. So even though you might not like that giant 8 to 10-inch blossom, the other blossoms are very, very nice once the plant gets going. Dinner plate dahlias, the plant size itself, they are among the largest of the dahlia plants. And in general, they are above 40 inches and can even get as high as 60 plus inches if they like where they are. Okay, this little guy here was the star of our garden this year, and that's Manhattan Island. And I'm sorry to say that even this photo, and we took a lot of them of this one, even this photo doesn't give you the sense of that red. It was absolutely breathtaking and highlighted by that yellow near the center. So a beautiful, beautiful dahlia. This one I have 2 pictures of, because this is Otto's Thrill. And I don't know who Otto is, but I'll tell you one thing, it is a thrill. And even if you're not into dahlias, now that you know the name Otto's Thrill, you will identify this dahlia in whatever garden you go to that has this plant growing. You talk about voluptuous, well, that's defined by Otto's Thrill, and it is definitely a thrill to grow and a thrill to see when it is blossoming. It often has this characteristic of 2 gigantic blossoms right next to each other, so twins, and boy, it absolutely dominates the garden. This is a smaller dinner plate dahlia. This is called Dazzling Sun, and it is known more for its subtlety, though the yellow in this particular one is nowhere near as vibrant as a lot of the Dazzling Sun yellows. This is Vancouver, one of the best of the burgundy purple dahlias, always identified by the white edging and the white tips. And again, a very, very voluptuous blossom. The first ones are easily in the 7 to 8 inch diameter range. This is Ferncliff Illusion. And as stunning as Manhattan Island was, this is stunning for its subtlety. This is just, even though its colors are muted and subtle, it really steals the show when it's in bloom. The blossoms again are in that 6 to 7 inch diameter range. Now this is another of the Dazzling series. This is Dazzling Magic, and if you're into the rust colors, Dazzling Magic is an excellent choice because the red is almost a rust colored red, and the yellow is definitely more muted than, say, in Dazzling Sun. And then this was a brand new introduction last year. And if you're just getting into dahlias and you want to be wowed, you should get this dahlia this year. This is called Tartan, Tartan. And tartan, no 2 blossoms are the same on the plant. It is just stunning. I looked at the header and said, oh, this is going to be a winner. And then we grew it, and it way exceeded our wildest expectations for it. Like I said, every single blossom on the plant is different. The blossoms are huge and fully double. This is a beautiful, I think it's going to be a part of dahlia collections for many years to come. And then I chose this one not so that you had a red dahlia, because all of you know there are lots of red dahlias, but to tell you, there are some historic dahlia series. We're going to talk about one in a few minutes. This is Babylon Red, and it was part of the Babylon series of dahlias, of which there were Babylon Purple, the same size and shape, but a deep purple, almost like a Thomas Edison. Then there was Babylon Bronze, which was more a yellowish bronze color. And then there was Babylon Red. They were and are consistent, beautiful, reliable performers. Unfortunately, today, the only one that's commercially available is the Babylon Red. And I don't know why the other two aren't available, but they were magnificent plants. And Babylon Red is a magnificent red dahlia. And then this is Bristol Stripe. And before tartan came along, I would have said, this is, if you want an unpredictable but consistently gorgeous dahlia, the one to pick would be Bristol Stripe. As you can see, it's whiter than tartan, but you can't rely on this thing to do the same thing twice, no matter what. There are times when our Bristol Stripes have been half burgundy and half white. It's a very unpredictable plant, absolutely gorgeous. The petals, in many cases, just twirl. So it's a good choice, a beautiful choice for bouquets. All right. The next most popular, probably the most popular dahlia grown today is the group known as the Decorative Dahlias. Now, if you go back to the classifications that the Royal Horticultural Society has created, they call the decorative, the dinner plate, and the gallery dahlias show dahlias, and they classify them by size: large, medium, and small. So the decorative dahlias are the medium-sized dahlias, but American retailers don't use that classification. They use dinner plates, they use decoratives, and then they use galleries for the small ones. The decorative dahlias, in general, the blossoms are 4 to 6 inches in diameter, and the plant heights are a little bit smaller than the plant heights for the dinner plate dahlias, usually ranging in the 28, 36 inch size, though some can get in excess of 40 inches. Now, I show you this dahlia because this is one of the 2 lavender dahlias that are consistently offered by growers. This is called Lilac Thyme, and it is the smaller of the 2 purple lavender dahlias. The other one is called Lavender Perfection, and it is a true dinner plate. It is slightly lighter, and the petal tips are more rounded than Lilac Thyme. Lilac Thyme has a little bit of a point to each petal, and it's got that beautiful yellow at the throat that really highlights the lavender qualities. I wanted to show you, because it's so pretty, what this thing looks like as it's just opening up. See the purple in the center? It really is always showing off, and it's a lovely purple lavender flower to have in your garden. And then this one, if you're going to grow a decorative dahlia, you should choose this one. This is Firepot. It's hard to describe how beautiful this dahlia is in the garden, and what it becomes when either the early morning light or the sunset light hits it. It almost radiates. It is so beautiful. So all I can tell you is, if you're looking for one, unless you hate these colors, you should choose Firepot. This is the blackest, and traditionally the blackest of all dahlias. This is called Karma Chalk. And this particular blossom had been blooming for about 2 days. So as you can see, the petals have begun to fade in the sunlight to a more burgundy than black. But when this blossom first opens, those petals are black. It's on the small side. Those blossoms never get any bigger than 4 inches in diameter and often are 3 inches in diameter. So they make for good vase cuttings. But also you have to understand that because of its blackness, it often steals the show when it's in a vase. So 1 or 2 is sufficient in a cluster of dahlias. Okay, this is Blue Boy, and Blue Boy is a very distinctive shade of purple. It is almost a bluish purple. This particular photo hasn't been doctored to make it seem bluer. So you know that this is the true color of Blue Boy. Again, on the smaller side, a good 4-inch diameter blossom. And then this is Bahama Apricot. Years ago, they had a photograph of Bahama Apricot where the yellow that you're looking at was apricot colored. But unfortunately, I don't think a single plant ever produced blossoms that had apricot color in them. So it's a misnomer. It's called Bahama Apricot, but the flowers are almost always sunshine yellow. And in our gardens, we've never seen it be anything else but this color, this sunshine yellow. Okay, gallery dahlias are the smallest of the show dahlias. Their blossom sizes are small, 1 to 2 inches. So they make good border plants. They do not make good cutting plants. And I have not seen a gallery dahlia that has more than a single layer of petals. The plant heights are between 12 and 24 inches, with 12 being closer to the norm than 24 inches. And there is a series now that is becoming more and more famous. It's called the Dark Angel series, because the plants, the leaves themselves are absolutely black. You can see this is a dark angel. I'm guessing it's probably Dracula. And you can see this plant, the leaves are absolutely black, not reddish black, but black. Dracula looks like this when it blooms. And let me give you a close-up. So the blooms are relatively insignificant. The plant itself is really what's stunning about this dahlia. It does get covered with these little single layered blossoms. But like I said, you're growing this plant for a border and for its blackness. Another very popular in the Dark Angel series dahlia is this dahlia, again with the black foliage. It's called Painted Lady. And you can see here, sorry for the holes in the petals, but with these guys, it's hard to get a cluster of them blooming all at the same time. Painted Lady is definitely pink, and she's got a very, very interesting central disc with the yellow around the edge of a burgundy disc. But these, you really should only consider them for borders. I would not choose them as for a container plant for its showiness, because it's really, you're growing it for the foliage. Any more questions, Jennifer?
Yes. Somebody asked, I am not sure about winter on the Cape. Did you say we need to lift tubers, or could we add as extra mulch? Thank you.
Okay, on the Cape, I would add extra mulch. And I think you're going to be okay. There's only that once in a 25-year circumstance where you have an incredibly cold winter on the Cape where the dahlias might not make it. The point that I forgot to tell you in that part of this talk is that dahlias actually can withstand incredible cold. The tubers themselves can't be frozen solid. What kills dahlias through the winter is when they are planted in an area that pools water only in the winter. So what happens is the combination of the cold and the water roots the tubers instantly. So that's what you want to think about when you're choosing a place for dahlias where you don't want to have to lift them. I hope that answers the question. Anything else, Jennifer?
That's it.
Okay. All right. Okay. If you don't remember anything about this little talk, I'd like you to remember the story of the Cactus Dahlias and one other point that we're going to make at the very end. There's no question that Cactus Dahlias are some of, if not the most dramatic dahlias in the dahlia family. They are fully double blossoms with dramatically thin, long pointed petals, and often the petals will twist and curl in all sorts of artistic ways. In general, the blossoms are large, 5 to 7 inches, and the plants can range from a short 28 to a very tall 52 inches. But this is the story I want you to remember about dahlias, in particular Cactus Dahlias. In 1872, a Dutchman by the name of J.T. Vanderburg received from a friend of his who was in Mexico a box of dahlia tubers. Now, most of the tubers, because it takes so long to get them from Mexico to Holland, most of the tubers were dead or in terrible condition. But there were a few tiny nodules that looked like they might still be alive. And so he set to work bringing these nodules to life. And he did this throughout 1872 and 1873. When he finally got plants mature enough to bloom, they were Cactus Dahlias. And no one in Europe had ever seen anything like these plants. Those dahlias initiated a craze, not quite like tulip mania, but similar in magnitude and hysteria to the tulip interest of the mid-1600s. The French, in particular, just fell in love with these Cactus Dahlias, and I don't speak French, so forgive this butchering of the pronunciation. They called them les étoiles du diable, the stars of the devil. And they did, from that point on, a lot of work with dahlia propagation. Now, here's the fascinating thing about this story. Up until the 1990s, agricultural scientists, horticultural scientists believed that the Cactus Dahlias were just a spontaneous mutation of the original dahlia species, probably brought on by what they had suffered in order to get to Holland in 1872. But all scientists prior to the 1990s would have told you that the Cactus Dahlias were just regular dahlias that had mutated. However, by the 1990s, DNA research was inexpensive enough that it could be applied to a lot of ornamental horticulture. And so they took a look at the Cactus Dahlias, and they found that the Cactus Dahlias are not mutations of the original species. They are their own species. So, ladies and Dan, what I want you to understand is that little box that came to J.T. Vanderburg brought some of the last Cactus Dahlias, because they now feel that they're extinct, some of the last Cactus Dahlias to Holland. And Vanderburg propagated them, and they became available to the rest of the world. You talk about happenstance, fortuitous happenstance. This is one of those rare moments. We wouldn't have Cactus Dahlias today if it hadn't been for that Vanderburg friend who sent a box of dahlia tubers from Mexico. Remember that. It truly, from a scientific and genetic perspective, is a truly incredible story. So let's look just briefly at a few. This is my favorite Cactus Dahlia. I love this dahlia. I talk to it. Its name is Freak-o-lay, but I call it Freak. And it looks like this. Each one is different. Each blossom is different on the plant. But it, you know, it's one of these guys that gets up in the morning, doesn't brush its hair, and that's how it looks. All of you have seen people, all of you have friends like that. That's Freak. Only Freak, when she doesn't blow dry her hair or brush her hair, looks absolutely beautiful. And then this is Starlite, and we're going to talk a little bit more about Starlite later on, but this is a beautiful, exquisite, exotic dahlia. And then this guy, this is Nuit d'été. And Nuit d'été looks like this every single year. It takes a long time for these petals to unfurl enough so that you can see the central disc. But the central disc makes this plant, because if it weren't for that brilliant yellow in the middle, you wouldn't notice all the variation in those burgundy to black cactus petals. All right, SemiCactus. I don't know why they make this distinction, because there are some SemiCactus dahlias that should be cactus dahlias, and there are some cactus dahlias that I think should be SemiCactus dahlias. The only difference between the two is that the petals of the SemiCactus dahlias are a touch broader than the ones in the cactus dahlias. But again, they're distinguished by fully double, very thin, slightly rounded or pointed petals. The blossoms are 5 to 7 inches in diameter, and the plants run from between 28 inches high to 52 inches high. Now this, if you were to look at this, I look at this and say, this is a true cactus dahlia, but it's not. Striped Vulcan, and it's considered a semi-cactus dahlia. Then you get, this is Tahiti Sunrise. This is interesting because this is a very short plant. It rarely gets more than 28 to 30 inches tall. And each one of these blossoms is exquisite, very complex. If you look at it, it's got burgundy, it's got pink, it's got white, and then it's got that central yellow disc. It's it really is a beautiful blossom. And then this, I wouldn't even call this a cactus dahlia, but this is a semi-cactus dahlia known as Cabana Banana. What is lovely about this is the degree of yellow in this blossom, because it catches the morning light and literally takes your breath away. Now, let's go back. This one, when it catches the afternoon light, does the same thing. When that sun is near the horizon and hits this plant or hits this Cabana Banana, it's a magnificent visual experience. Then now we're getting into the weird ones. Okay, anemone flowering dahlias, there's no question they're the most bizarre. They usually have very huge central discs. The blossoms are small, but that doesn't matter because they're so bizarre and so stunning that 1 to 3 inches still takes your breath away. And the plants in general are on the smaller side, rarely getting taller than 40 inches. Now, I love this one. This is Blue Bayou. It is not going to be available this year, but if you run across this plant, snatch it, because these are exquisitely complex and visually beautiful blossoms. This is Florinor. Florinor will be available this year, but it's really unpredictable. Take a quick look at this photo, and then this is also Florinor. Now, more often Florinor looks like this photo, but it can look like this one just as easily, just not as frequently. And then this dahlia, they're moving from the classification of anemone flowering to quote unquote specialty. And that's just a way of saying they don't have any idea what to call this particular plant. A lot of times this is called twinings or twinnings smarty. And half the plant will be the burgundy and half the plant will be white, or they'll alternate. You'll have one burgundy petal and the next petal will be white and the next petal will be burgundy, etc. And oftentimes this particular dahlia is a single layered dahlia. Then we get peony flowering dahlias, and I think they are slowly but surely going to cease to exist. Currently, there's only one available, and the only reason it's available is it is the most historic dahlia we have commercially available today, and that's Bishop of Llandaff. The blossoms are at most only several layers, and the plant itself, the blossoms are about 3 to 4 inches in diameter. Very short plants. This is a lousy picture of Bishop of Llandaff, but it's the only one I've got. The red is hard to describe. It is so incredibly intense, and then set off by that yellow, brilliant yellow central disc. I want to show you one more of these peony flowering dahlias. This is Sunshine. It has not been available for several years, but as you can see, even though it's a single layer, this plant really is stunning in a garden full of stunning dahlias. Another favorite, at least of mine, are the Fimbriata dahlias. Fimbriata in Latin means fringed, and you're about to see why these dahlias are really, that name is appropriate for these dahlias. The blossoms are always large, 6 to 8 inches. The plants can range all over the place, from 32 inches to 56 inches tall. This is probably the most famous of all the Fimbriata dahlias, and this is Kogana Fubuki. It comes in a range of colors. This one is pink. Sometimes they're salmon pink. Sometimes they're orange around a yellow center that then tends to fade into the pink colors. This dahlia a couple of years ago was called Ice Crystal, and now it's called Canary Fubuki. And you can see where it would get its name from, the Fimbriata part of the name, because it really does look like a blossom that's fringed. This is going to be a brand new introduction this year, but it actually is a dahlia that's been around for at least a decade. It was originally called Winter Spring, and now it's called Pinelands Princess. And it's Winter Spring was exquisite, so I'm sure this one is going to be equally exquisite with those pointed pink tips, and then fading into that yellow at the center. Oh, and then this little guy, and notice, we have to admit, dahlias are very prone to Japanese beetles, and there's one making his way through the central disc. This is Alana Claire, and it is it's just a, well, it speaks for itself. And then we get to the PomPom dahlias. Now, I have not misspelled PomPom. That's what these dahlias are called, Pompon. They're very distinctively shaped because they are ball shaped in general. The blossoms are highly reflexed, and they do form something of a ball shape. The blossoms are small, 2 to 3 inches, but very sturdy and very long lasting. And the plants are definitely on the short side, 28 to 36 inches. This is Boom Boom White. Obviously, you know why it would be called that. And then this is Golden Scepter. This is the yellow PomPom. This is Geneva, just introduced about a year or two ago. And then this is the one that many people recognize. This is Marble Ball. Again, it's one of these that is very unpredictable. You can have marble balls that are entirely that deep burgundy color. You can have marble balls that are half burgundy and half white, but they're supposed to look like this. So they often do, they often don't as well. Any more questions?
Yes, you had showed that Japanese beetle, but before that, somebody asked if voles or other pests eat dahlias.
Okay, lots of things eat dahlias. It's their greatest problem. Voles will eat them if they're left in the ground over the winter. Voles will not eat them during the spring, the summer, and the fall. Deer will eat them. That's why it's good to know how to grow them in containers where you can perhaps protect them from deer. Doggone Japanese beetles think they're dessert. So there are lots of things that can challenge the dahlia grower, but all those things are manageable, especially if you can grow them in containers. Anything else, Jennifer? Okay.
Nope, that's it.
Okay, now just very briefly, I want to go over with you some of the true heirloom dahlias. And I want you to understand this is a very unique group of flowers, because dahlias, and we're going to discuss this in a minute, dahlias have a trait that used to in the 1960s was scientifically referred to as bottom recessives. All we need to know is that dahlias are not stable. A single plant is not stable. From year to year, that plant can change like you wouldn't believe. So the fact that you have 5 dahlias that consistently produce blossoms from a single plant year after year, and the blossoms are identical, these are truly remarkable plants. If you look at, okay, Bishop is our oldest, and we've already seen Bishop. 1884, this plant was introduced, and it looks the same as it did when it was introduced in 1884. The foliage is dark black, but can, in certain light conditions, have a tinge of green to it. Then you get Thomas. Well, Thomas is my favorite all-time dahlia. And I have taken pictures of Thomas in rain, in clouds, in pure sun, in partly cloudy, to try to capture the purple of this blossom. And this is as close as I've ever come. This is one breathtaking flower. Even if you don't like purple, you fall in love with this flower. It is gorgeous. And Thomas was introduced in 1929. Then you have Kelvin, and I think Kelvin is 1959. Yep, Kelvin is 1959. The thing that is wonderful about Kelvin, or not so wonderful if you don't like those great big blossoms, Kelvin's first blossom will easily be 10 inches in diameter, but so will its second and its third. Kelvin's blossoms don't get littler. Eventually, after it's been blooming for maybe 3 months, you'll start seeing smaller blossoms. But it's remarkable in that it just keeps putting out these giant dinner plate blossoms. And this is actually, this Kelvin doesn't give you the feeling of how intense the yellow is in this blossom. If you're looking for a yellow dahlia, your first choice ought to be Kelvin. This is Snow Country, and she produces a couple of nice white large blossoms, but then she moves into being more reasonable and manageable, and her blossoms usually by about 2 months into the season are about 6 inches in diameter, so they're a manageable blossom for a vase. And Snow Country, I think, was 1994. And then this is Lady Darlene. This is an exquisite dahlia. He was introduced, I think, in 1984 and has been hugely popular ever since. And you can, from this photo, you can understand why. This is just one beautiful flower, very, very daintily edged with that deep burgundy red edging, and then the center with that yellow stays with each petal down near its throat. So a beautiful dahlia. Okay, let's talk just a little bit about this bottom recessive trait. Dahlias are notoriously unstable. Don't get upset with us or with yourself if you save dahlias from year to year and the plants don't look anything like they did the year before. That's just the way these dahlias are. Maybe it's because they're not grown any longer on the Mexican highlands. I don't know. But as I said earlier, that's why Thomas Edison and Kelvin Floodlight and Lady Darlene and Snow Country and Bishop of Landolph are so special because they are absolutely stable and have been stable for almost 50 years in a few cases and well over 50 years in a few cases. Okay, just to give you an idea of how unstable they can be. Remember, this was the SemiCactus dahlia called striped Vulcan. Well, this is also the SemiCactus dahlia striped Vulcan. These two plants were grown in 2 containers right next to each other. They don't look like they're related at all, but they're genuinely both striped Vulcan tubers. It's incredible how dahlias can change. If you're really interested in getting to know more about dahlias and bulbs in general, I strongly recommend the 2 books that you see on the screen now. I don't know how John Bryant put the amount of work that he did into his volumes 1 and 2, but they're well worth having in any library. And if you truly love plants and you know that they have a character all their own, that's why you should get Anna's book. It's very well done. Both of these books, I think, are out of print, so you have to go on Amazon. But if you do buy Anna Pavord's book, what you should do is read her discussion of paper whites. I think it should go down in horticultural literature as one of the funniest pieces you will ever read about plants. Any more questions?
Nope, not at this time. I don't see any.
Okay. I want to take just a moment and I ask for your patience to give you a little commercial. Now's the time of the year that you should be planting fall blooming. Let me say that again. Fall blooming bulbs. These are bulbs that you plant now and they will bloom in another 6 weeks. What you're looking at, even though it looks purple, are the giant pink autumn crocus. They tend to have, some can be true pink, some can also have this purplish tinge to them. They are colchicums. If you know, there's a difference between crocus and colchicum. They are exquisite, but you do need several in a cluster. Each bulb will give you the first year 2 to 3 blossoms, and then eventually about 6 blossoms per bulb. This one, and you can just barely, forgive me for the quality of the photo, this is saffron crocus coming out of the ground. And then this is a saffron crocus that is now blooming, and it's those orange stamen, the pollen from those orange stamen that is the spice saffron. These are the crocuses that they harvest today to get the spice saffron. And then if you're considering getting a fall blooming bulb, I would recommend this one. This is the water lily crocus. It is not at all related to water lilies, and it doesn't need to be in a moist environment. The water lily crocus looks just like this and blooms in Wellfleet. It's going to bloom sometime in the month of October, maybe as early as September. But this is an exquisite surprise as your garden is beginning to look very weary. They poke their heads up, kind of like naked ladies. They poke their heads up and bloom in the fall. And then they produce foliage, green stuff in the spring, but no blossoms. They come back year after year and they are deer resistant. Let me say that again, deer resistant. So if you have an inclination for these, and I have to tell you, once you've planted one, you'll plant more. I hope you find a way to put some in each of your gardens, because there's just no way to describe the joy that they will bring you when your weary garden sees these beautiful things bloom in the fall. The reason you don't see them very often is because their shelf life is extremely short, like we're talking days. And so it doesn't make sense for most garden centers to bring in these bulbs because they're blooming by the time they've been out on the shelf for a week. And the last thing I want to leave you with is the dahlia's secret. We've talked about the fact that its tubers were inedible. We talked about the fact that it grows well in containers, and how its beauty is such an asset in the garden. But its beauty isn't its most important asset. Its most important asset comes in the late fall, when, like I said earlier, it's the last man standing in the garden. As those of you who know bees know that by the fall, they are beginning to get ready to hibernate in their hives, and there's not a lot of activity, but they do need nourishment. And sometimes the bees travel in the course of a day way too far from their hives to get back to their hives at night. They're desperately looking for nourishment. So this is where the dahlia comes into play, because if the bee is far from home and not going to make it to its hive that night, and bees don't like to fly in the dark, the bee lands on the dahlia and then crawls up underneath its petals. And there the dahlia keeps the bee warm and dry and safe until in the morning it can return to its home. So of all the things and all the pleasures that dahlias give us, perhaps the greatest is that it protects some of our pollinators in the late fall. And with that happy and comforting thought, I leave you ladies to a great meeting. Thank you.
Somebody asked one final question, which was, what are some good sources to buy them?
Okay. We have a very large collection. I would also recommend Brent and Becky's. They have a very large, probably larger than ours. And then there's Swan Island Dahlias on the West Coast. All of those growers are very reliable and are basically selling you dahlias from the stock, so that the plants should produce blossoms that look like the blossoms on your headers.
Great.
Anything else? Okay, thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, Jean. And thanks, Wellfleet Gardeners.
Thank you. Great talk.
All righty. Okay. Okay.
Thank you, Barbara.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Barbara, if you can return that form that I sent to you.
I will do that, Jean.
Okay, wonderful. I need
Thank
that to get you paid.
Okay.
This was
Okay.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
thank you. Thank you very much.
You are very welcome.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and end this, okay?
Yes, please.
Thank you, Jennifer.